Despite what my channel might look like, I really wouldn't consider myself a massive anime fan, and that's why I'm really surprised that I fell in love with Kakegurui. This show is literally everything that keeps me away from anime wrapped up in a singular package, but somehow it sucked me in with just how ludicrous it got. I fell in love with the story, the characters, the over-the-top expressions, the animation, the humor. It almost all clicked for me in a way I can't exactly describe, and that's why it definitely hurts for me to say that while I got super into the first season, the second season didn't just let me down, it dropped me off a cliff. I am getting a bit ahead of myself. Before we talk about the problems with the second season, we need to answer the question, what is Kakegurui? Well, Kakegurui is a show all about gambling. Woo! Big money, no whammies! Ow, I am gonna butcher the name of this so hard. Hyakkou Academy, I hope I got that right, is full of the families of powerful people in terms of influence or politics. And because of that, these students have a lot of money to throw around, so gambling booths pop up a lot. And if a student happens to go into debt, they're branded as what's known as a house pet. And as you might imagine, these people are not treated very well, as they're publicly ridiculed and allowed to be bullied consequence-free. Now, normally in anime, the fact that everything takes place in high school isn't really relevant or even admittedly necessary to the plot, but here it kind of is necessary because it gives a reason for the characters to come back every episode. If this wasn't set in high school, the characters could honestly just leave and not come back. The first episode has one of the main characters talking about potentially dropping out because he can't keep up, but dropping out of school or even transferring to another school isn't really something that's up to you at that age. The story of season 1 follows Yumiko Jabami, a new transfer student who shows up not really knowing much about gambling, but it turns out she's an absolute superwoman when it comes to reading people and also batshit insane.
命を運天賦に委ねるなど正気の沙汰ではありません。にもかかわらず、カジノに人が集まるのは命をかける狂気に人は快感を覚えるからです。であれば、ギャンブルは狂っているほど面白い。駆け狂いましょう。
She works really well as a protagonist because while I did just describe her as a superwoman gambler, she does still have the ability to lose when games are rigged too heavily against her or in games that are purely left up to chance. Despite the fact that Yumiko is the protagonist, the show pulls a To Kill a Mockingbird, and if you don't know what that is, you're probably too young to be watching this video, where the main character and the point of view characters are separate. The point of view character we follow is a guy named Suzui, who starts off as a house pet and isn't really great at gambling, but he gets tasked with showing Yumiko around the school on her first day and suddenly gets dragged into the ensuing insanity. And he honestly works really well as a straight man for the madness to come. I wouldn't call him an audience surrogate, he has his own personality, and he's not a complete newbie to the system, but he's still detached enough from the insanity that Yumiko brings to make him a good bridging character between the audience and the rest of the show. The overarching narrative of the first season revolves around Yumiko finding a taste for gambling after transferring to the school, and after hearing stories about how strong of a gambler the student council president is, she wants to test herself against the president. But unfortunately, the path to get there isn't super simple. The other students, especially members of the student council, all initially see Yumiko as a random transfer student and basically a new toy for them to break. But as they realize Yumiko is a lot more skilled than they had imagined, they all have to come up with their own unique strategies to try and stop Yumiko from destroying this system that allows them to be on top of the social hierarchy. Now, that premise sounds very Monster of the Week, and yeah, I'm not even going to deny that. The setup is basically watching each student council member get knocked down one after another, but the show stays entertaining because each of the student council members are legitimately interesting, with the exception of Yuriko. The stakes are genuinely raised for each game, and there are genuine consequences for losing. Also, let me make something clear right out of the gate. No, I have not read the manga. I know it continues on past what the end of the show is right now, and it has a lot of stuff that was cut out from the show, but when you're making an adaptation, you need to have it stand on its own, completely independent of the source material. Saying the manga was better doesn't really negate criticism of the show. Also, before we begin, I do want to give a huge thank you to everybody who supported me with the Don't Hug Me I'm Scared video. It genuinely means a lot to me, and I really appreciate it. I'm sorry that this video took a while to make. I'm trying my best to get back onto this, and I hope you guys are along for the ride. This video is primarily going to be focused on Season 2's problems, but I can't really talk about why XX didn't really hit for me if I don't explain why Season 1 did. The first big game they play is rock, paper, scissors, but using cards drawn from a box, so you can't be certain you're going to have all the choices available. That's a pretty neat idea that adds depth and an interesting aspect to a simple game that makes it interesting for a story without making it overly complicated. It's a great look into how the environment within the academy works. Everyone has a lot on the line, and despite what PSAs in the 90s will tell you, cheating unfortunately does pay off. This game is also the introduction of our third main character, Mary Saotome. Best girl! Best girl! Best girl! Oh, sorry, forgive me. Mary has about 2/3 of the class in her pocket, all voting in a way that will give her the advantage when Suzui gives a signal to the rest of the class. Yumiko keeps switching between small and large bets to figure out how Mary is cheating, but by the time she has a full grasp on how it's happening, she's already out of chips.
側近で1000万。なんでそんな現金持ち歩いて。
Alright then, I guess the game is continuing for one final bet. Before they pick cards for the final game, Yumiko reveals that she knows Mary is cheating to put her on edge, but Mary denies it all, and while thinking about changing her strategy, decides to rely on the formula that let her win every round up till this point.
勝負！じゃんけんぽん！
Yumiko later reveals that she ended up just getting lucky by drawing scissors from the box, and considering she knew Mary's strategy, Yumiko would have had a guaranteed win, so she called Mary out just to add more chaos into the game so she still had a chance to lose even though she drew scissors from the box. Yumiko puts Mary into debt and saves Suzui from his debt all on her first day at her new school. And this is just the beginning. I don't have too much to say about the earlier games in the first season because they're all really simple, but that simplicity is a large part of what makes them work. The second game is a game of match played with 2 decks of cards. Pick 2 cards to check. If they're a match, flip again. If not, the other player takes turns to flip cards over, and whoever gets more matches wins. The fun of the games early on is trying to figure out how the other player is cheating, and in this case, the cards are marked on the back with very slight differences that give away what cards they are, but they're so minor that nobody looking normally would ever see the difference. But we're not following someone normal, we're following gambling superwoman Yumiko Jabami, who notices the differences on the first game and plays very dumb and panicked to bait Sumeragi into getting cocky and playing again, only to lose spectacularly.
私の番になったらこれで54枚。私の勝ちですね。は？
Sumeragi is great. I'm so glad this isn't the only time we see her. She's so over the top in such a fun way that she's just as entertaining as an antagonist now as she is as a protagonist later in the season.
I have the power of God!
With Yumiko now hooked on her initial taste of gambling, she wants to pursue it more, and heads over to the Culture Club to play a game with the head of the club and a member of the student council, Yuriko.
22歯が刺さっているため判定は死。ゆり子様のチップを合わせて合計4960万円のマイナスで決着です。
お疲れ様でした、早乙女さん。誰か外へお連れして。もう用済みですから。
Yeah, Mary in the beginning of the first season is more of a jobber than Joey Wheeler.
Rule number 1 in the Joey Wheeler rulebook is never back down from any challenge.
I'm gonna be brutally honest here, Yuriko is the most forgettable character in this show. Her design is unique, but unfortunately her design is a major reason why she's forgettable. Every character in this show is hyper expressive, and the eyes are a huge part of it. From Yumiko or the president glowing in anticipation, Suzui going wide-eyed in shock, or a character from later in the show missing one of her eyes to be a visual representation of a vital aspect of her personality, eyes are a major part of this series, and they included a character who constantly keeps her eyes closed and can't be nearly as expressive. The game they play for this round is basically a slightly more complicated version of roulette, where the ball and wheel are replaced with falling swords. Just like the last few games, Yuriko is cheating to keep her status in in the school, and the way she's cheating is through magnets that slightly alter the trajectory of the swords, which leads to Yumiko pulling the same strategy she used against Mary and Sumeragi, calling out the cheating to put her opponent on edge. But this time, it doesn't work, and Yumiko loses, going into 310 million yen of debt, which is about $2.3 million.
まさか勝ってしまうとまでは思わなかったわ。ゆり子、あなたはなかなか強運じゃない。見直したわ。それに比べて、あなたは残念だったわね。頑張ったのに、こんなラッキーパンチに負けてしまって。
This is the first proper introduction to the president, who really takes an interest in Yumiko and absolutely screams final boss energy. We find out later that the president actually rigged the game against Yumiko by altering the results from under the floor, and that's why Yumiko lost. But she's not upset about this. Yumiko and the president both see this less as a setback and more as a way to truly test Yumiko and see if she can work her way out of rock bottom. With Yumiko now a house pet, she's almost immediately bullied by the other students, and then things go way beyond bullying in ways I can't talk about because I only just got monetization on YouTube and I don't want to deal with immediately being demonetized. Let's just say it's not good, and this guy is the worst character in the entire series. It's also at this time that we learn that there's a secondary aspect to being a house pet that's really messed up beyond belief, and that's putting it lightly. When a girl becomes a house pet, they're given a life plan book, basically instructions from the student council for the rest of their lives if they can't pay off their debts. The house pets are basically being forced into human trafficking to pay off their debts.
愛する夫と共に子供や孫に囲まれた温かな老後を大化なく過ごし、早乙女メアリは女としての幸福を極めた。これ以上望みようのない人生を送ることになる。そんなものクソくらいだ。私の人生は私のもの。
Best girl. Now, luckily, the life plans aren't like slave labor and they're more akin to a forced marriage, but that's still human trafficking. So Mary and Yumiko are both in considerable debt and have these life plans hanging over their heads. But it's okay because the school holds a debt relief game. Everyone teams up in groups of 4 to play a variant of Indian poker, where the winner of each game gets their debts paid off by the student council, while the loser of each game gets all the debt dumped on them. The student council keeps track of the debts owed throughout the school, but despite this, they still make the students fill out a form to report the debts they're playing with in the debt relief game. And the players don't have to report their actual values if they don't want to.
Word up, Yoshi Sor Munchakupas is my name, and I'ma tell you how I beat the IRS at their own game.
Yumiko and Mary team up and switch their debts to be able to not only confuse the other players at the table, including this guy from earlier that I want to remind you is the worst character in the series, into not knowing the values of the chips in play, and scam the student council out of a ton of money in the process. It's such a fun scene because every player at the table is cheating and playing mind games with each other. And rather than everyone versus everyone, it becomes a 2v2, since this jackass has this other girl almost literally on a leash, and Yumiko helps her stand up to her abuser while also letting Mary walk away with the cash prize. And Mary shares the money with Yumiko so she can pay off her debt, which Yumiko, unsurprisingly at this point, doesn't do. She has the money and can pay off her debt, but she refuses to pay it to remain a house pet, as house pets are allowed to challenge members of the student council to gambling matches without the ability to refuse. I haven't talked about Midari up until this point because she really hasn't been relevant to the story until now, but now that she is, oh, Midari! Midari is the most insane character in the show, and that's a goddamn achievement in this series. This game is probably my favorite of the first season. I admit that I'm biased as hell here because Saw 1 is one of my favorite movies of all time, and if this isn't taking direct inspiration from that movie, I honestly don't know what is.
I don't give a crap if you covered yourself in peanut butter and had a 15-hooker gangbang.
This is the first death game in the series, which are very rare, and I'm glad that they're rare because despite how insane the cast is, you need to be a special kind of crazy to actually bet your life. The game is played with symbol cards. Suzui is kept away from Midari and Yumiko and lays out the 5 cards on the table in front of him, while Midari and Yumiko have to guess the order he placed the cards down. Midari is a really interesting character because she actually wants to lose the games after betting things such as death and bodily harm.
Are you getting off on the danger of the situation?
Maybe.
Oh, you.
Are you serious?
Oh, ew.
Don't kink shame me!
She views getting hurt as winning, so Midori rigs the game in Yumiko's favor because she wants to be killed by someone she has respect for. But Yumiko is able to Giga Brain her way into forcing a tie for the game so she doesn't have to die or become an involuntary murderer. And this game really shows that there is a bit more to Yumiko than just being able to read people and horny for risk. Yumiko is very against the idea of unfair games. If all the risk is one-sided, she sees that as unforgivable. And this adds a lot more depth to her game with Mary, where she deliberately called out the cheating and allowed Mary to switch her strategy last moment. She doesn't like hoarding all of the risk to herself. And this carries over for the rest of the series. Yumiko becomes good friends, or is at the very least extremely appreciative towards anyone she gambles with, but she holds a huge amount of resentment for Midori for the rest of the series. There is a lot of backstory to Midori and even her own manga spin-off series, so as much as I want to go into it now, I'm gonna leave that for a potential future video if this ever gets animated. Mary's standalone spin-off series recently got an anime series, so it's not completely out of the question for Midori. Before the start of the next game, we get to see the return of Sumeragi. She got kicked out of the student council after losing to Yumiko, and she tries to use Yumiko to get back into a position of power. But Yumiko is just happy to have some friends, regardless of the situation, and I'm okay with this because Sumeragi is honestly just a really fun character to be around. It's time for another game and another member of the student council to face off against. An idol named, oh god, I'm gonna butcher this, Yumemete. The idol game is okay. It's tic-tac-toe, but with challenges that need to be won in order to pick where you want to mark. Yumemete wants to use Yumiko for publicity and sets up the bet that if Yumiko loses, she has to become her partner as an idol. And Yumiko likes the terms originally, but she doesn't think it's fun unless both players are risking something substantial. So she snuck a recording of Yumemete talking about how much she hates her fans, and says that if Yumemete loses, the recording needs to be played on stage in front of the crowd of her fans. Now for most celebrities, I would assume this wouldn't be that big of an issue, but her entire brand is how much she cares about her fanbase and goes to the point of remembering their birthdays and even what shows they've attended. So this would be a major blow to her plans and especially hurt her end goal, which is to get popular as an idol, utilize her stardom to get into movies, and win an Oscar. Okay. The game itself is relatively fun, with a lot of mind games being played back and forth, but I'm gonna be honest, it's hard to find it super engaging because it's sandwiched between my two favorite games of the show. So it's not exactly a letdown, just not as good as the game before or the game after. It all wraps up with Yumiko kicking Yumemete's ass, and when the recording is played, the fans are annoyed at first, but eventually say they don't care if she doesn't care about them, they just care about her. It's fine as resolutions go, but nothing groundbreaking. However, it's followed immediately by the best game of the series. While Yumiko has been challenged by the student council members up until this point, this time it's Yumiko's turn to make a challenge against her next opponent. While still on stage, she calls for an official match against the student council's treasurer, Menuda. And since she's a house pet, he isn't allowed to refuse. This quickly becomes the biggest and craziest game of the entire series. Let me put this into context. A few games have spanned across more than one episode, but whenever that happens, there are periods of time not playing the game to get character development. But this game is 2 entire episodes of just playing the game, and it never once feels boring. The game they play is choice poker. It's just like normal 5-card poker, but with the caveat that whoever bets more than the other person can choose whether the stronger hand wins or the weaker hand wins. This game is kind of representative of the entire society within the academy. With the willingness to put literally everything you have on the line and the skills to pull it off, the weak actually can win out. The best part about this game is that there is no cheating by either player. It's only mind games through trying to figure out what your opponent has and what their strategy is based on the cards they throw away. But it becomes clear that this is quickly going to turn into a dick measuring contest in terms of wealth, because whoever puts more on the line gets to determine the outcome. I haven't been talking too much about the amounts of money characters are betting because I'm a mix of Leprechaun and Bald Eagle, so I don't really have a ton of context for the currency, and it eventually just becomes big. But here, Oh, it matters. The first game of the show worked its way up to 10 million yen as the bet, but with how absurdly rich the members of the student council are because they're kids of some of the richest people in the country, a single chip in this game is worth 10 million yen. Yumiko has 310 million yen on hand, so she gets 31 chips, and then Menyuta comes out and slaps his massive cock on the table by starting with 100 chips. 1 billion yen to start. In normal poker, the main strategy is to keep adding money to the pot and cause your opponents to forfeit the money they've already added to the pot and fold. But here, there is no folding. So even if the opponent outbets you by 1 chip, you've given them the power to choose the outcome. The first few games go by with Yumiko taking back some ground with the first game, and then Menyuta using all of Yumiko's tendencies against her to force her to go all in on a losing hand. Yumiko does have legitimate skill at gambling, and while the first episode of the show made it seem like she's an infinite pool of money, she's really not. And with Menyuta always having the ability to outbet her, he has all the power in this situation. And since she loses the hand, Yumiko is out of money to bet, so Yumiko calls on a lifeline for help. Sumeragi.
仲間は困った時に助け合うものですよね。お金が尽きてしまってとても困っているんです。助けていただけないでしょうか。
Sumeragi wasn't great at gambling outside of her methods of cheating. The only reason she was in the student council in the first place was because she was the daughter of a major toy company's CEO and had the money to throw around. And now that she's friends with Yumiko, it's time for her to prove if she actually has the heart of a gambler. Sumeragi is very hesitant, and this begins a massive tug of war between Yumiko and Menyuta over Sumeragi. Menyuta even offers her a spot back in the student council, but after a lot of convincing, Sumeragi decides to enter the game and bankroll Yumiko for one final hand as the stakes get higher and higher. The personal investment is raised further by the fact that Sumeragi and Menyuta have history together. They made a pact to work their way to the top together, but Menyuta just left Sumeragi by the wayside when she lost to Yumiko. As the game goes on, it becomes increasingly clear that even with all of Sumeragi's money on the line, it's still not going to be enough to counter Menyuta, so Yumiko proposes an idea. If a student goes into debt and becomes a house pet, they're given a life plan, and Yumiko was given one when her debt was 310 million yen. But really, the life plan was just collateral for the debt and not an accurate measurement of what her life was worth. So this begs the question, how do you put a monetary value on what a life is truly worth? The characters in the show can't even fathom how to calculate that, and this is setting aside the fact that Sumeragi is very much against the idea of putting her actual life on the line for a single poker hand. Menyuta legitimately thinks about backing down, but after finding out that he can just barely win out if he bets his entire life as well, he swallows his pride and adds his life plan to the pot as well. These two are legitimately putting their entire lives on the line. No matter what, someone is walking away from this table as nothing more than a slave to the other. And Menyuta chooses that the stronger poker hand will win after seeing Yumiko get rid of a pair of queens, assuming she's going for a weaker hand. But she just so happens to also have 3 jacks in her hand. This game is ridiculous, but it's so much fun to watch, because while it technically is another Yumiko Goes Gigabrain play, the drama between the characters makes it so entertaining. I've been going off about this one game for several minutes because it just has so much to talk about, and if this doesn't get you to watch the show in its entirety, then I genuinely don't know what will. Menyuta has truly lost everything, and this leaves only one student council member left to play a game with, the president herself. Yumiko finally gets her chance to face off with the president, and in comparison to the insanity that was the last 2 games, this one is shockingly and actually fittingly contained. The writers know they can't top the stakes of the last game, so they don't exactly try to. They try to do something different, a game where there truly is no way to win and only ways to lose. The game uses a full deck of tarot cards, numbered from 0 to 21, and each player takes a chance to flip one over. If the card is upside down, the value is subtracted. If the card is right side up, the value is added. If the value at the end of the game is positive, Yumiko wins, and if it's negative, the president wins, and the loser drops out of the school. There's also a special card in play that is determined before the start of the game to be an instant win or instant lose card depending on the orientation, and while showing it off, the president marks the card with her nail polish. Only 3 cards are flipped over. first by Yumiko, then the president, and then surprisingly chosen by random, Suzui. Suzui has been our point of view character for most of this and hasn't really taken part in the games, but he spent enough time with Yumiko to fully understand her on a level he didn't even think he could. And after noticing the marked card on the table, he chooses not to flip it over and put it all up to chance rather than the surefire thing, which ends up tying the game and letting Yumiko and the president both stay in the school. When hearing it summed up in this way, it sounds a bit of a cop-out, like, ooh, nobody actually has to lose here. But really, the show isn't about the rewards and losses that come from gambling. It's about the risk itself and putting everything on the line, and Suzui finally understands that feeling. Yumiko hasn't really grown or changed as a character, since she can basically be summed up as the biggest bull this china shop of a society has ever seen, so it feels like an appropriate ending to showcase how Suzui has grown as a character, since it ties directly into the themes of the story. This feels like a really good finale, but I don't mean a season finale, I mean a series finale. If the show stopped here, I think it would have made for a great, conclusive ending to a hype-filled show. But this is a popular series now with likable characters that people relate to. You can't just let it go here, so it was only a matter of time before season 2 came out. I feel like having a season 2 at all was already a bad idea. Season 1 already hit the point where characters are putting their entire lives on the line, and the money amounts have gotten too big to fully keep in context. So they can't exactly raise the stakes anymore, unless they were to add in something stupid like actual political influence. So that's exactly what they do. They actually add a prize of political influence determined through gambling.
What are you, fucking stupid?
I feel like I need to be upfront with one of my biggest problems with season 2, and that's the fact that it ends in the middle of an arc. I get that that's not unheard of when it comes to anime adaptations of manga, but it's not like it stops at the halfway point or a cliffhanger ending that makes me want to pick up the manga to continue it. The arc feels like it's approaching its natural conclusion, and then it just stops without actually finishing. It's like they had a puzzle that was almost complete, and then chucked a handful of pieces at the end and said, there, it's finished. Even though a lot of pieces ended up on the floor. And I want to be clear, if you like season 2 and found enjoyment from it that I didn't, I don't want to take that away from you. I wish I liked XX, but I have to be true to myself and I can't pretend I liked something that I really didn't. The setup for season 2 is that the president of the student council, which is a position in this world that's tied to the leadership of the Bami clan, which has political and economic power outside of the school, steps down and puts the position up for grabs by giving everyone in the school a chip they can use to gamble, and whoever has the most chips at the end of the competition gets to have the position. But because the Bami clan is not a real thing in the real world that we as an audience can ground in reality like money is, and because they only speak about its influence in vague terms like controlling the entire country, it's hard to get a grasp on what it even means. It's like the difference between 1 million and 1 billion. 1 billion is orders of magnitude higher, but it's a hard concept to grasp, so your mind just goes big number for both of them. This prize is like that, it's ooh, big prize, but it's not clear how it matters in the scope of the world or the characters we're following. If there's one thing that defines gambling, it's risk. That was the entire purpose of the first season, and since nobody here is playing with their own money, and the only person risking anything is the president, who does have a lot more focus than she does in season 1, but not to the point of being a main character, the rest of the cast might as well be playing with Monopoly money for all that it matters, and Yumiko knows this. It's made very clear in both the first season and the beginning of season 2 that Yumiko doesn't care about the main goal. She just wants to have fun with the thrill of putting everything on the line. The only people who care about this new main goal are these new characters that we as the audience haven't been given a reason to be invested in. The first season had an established systematic hierarchy, and the story was basically watching a bull come in and tear the china shop to shreds. And season 2 can be summed up as the bull inspecting the china carefully and then deciding it's not even worth it to smash. The new characters introduced this season enter the show through a literal roll call, and the show expects me to go, yeah, I care about these guys. No! Season 1 didn't just dump all the characters at once. You do see most of them in the background or given a brief glimpse before they become important to the plot, and when they do, they're given entire sections dedicated just to them so the audience has time to learn about them and care. The reason this roll call of new characters is happening is because they're all relatives of the president, as each of their last names ends in Bami, hence the Bami clan. and Yumiko Jabami is later revealed to unknowingly be a member of the clan, but that really doesn't matter as much as it seems. And the issues with these characters isn't helped by the fact that major characters from the first season get completely sidelined. Suzui seems to stay as a good bridging character at the start of the season, but as it goes on, he shows up less and less, and really has no purpose in the story at all. Because Yumiko has outright stated she doesn't care about the prize on offer, XX constantly ends up switching the focus character. We get an episode dedicated to the idol from the first season, an episode dedicated to the president's assistant, where Yumiko is actually the antagonist, and a lot more time spent on Mary that also really doesn't go anywhere. Now, this would be fine in another series where it can tell stories from multiple perspectives, but considering Yumiko is still there through most of these stories but isn't the main character, it just feels awkward because they refuse to detach the story from her. I think the story here could have really benefited from going, yeah, Yumiko is here and she's occasionally going to show up, but we're going to spend this season to focus elsewhere, and just told the stories they wanted to tell without having to shoehorn Yumiko into the plots. And it's sad for me to say that the games also took a massive hit in quality this season, so let's get into them. The game that starts us off is actually kinda great. It's basically Boom Boom Balloon, but with more body horror. Each player takes a turn cutting a rope that might drop the guillotine and cut off a finger. And it's pretty obvious that this game is rigged to not cut off anybody's fingers even before that's expressly stated. But it's fun because one of the new characters is completely underestimating the insanity and mental prowess of the characters in the school. All Yumiko has to do is be a little bit vague about an adjustment to the device to the mediator, and it's enough to get into the head of the new girl and cause her to chicken out, despite knowing the game is rigged and won't cut her finger off. The explanation of this game goes on a bit too long, but I'm not going to complain about getting more Midori.
同じ痛みを感じようぜ一発目はねえか
I don't have too much to say about it because it's just a generally good introductory game that's fun to watch the anxiety grow in the new girl and Suzui, while Midori and Yumiko just continue to be completely nonplussed. It's really interesting to see Yumiko's hatred for Midori grow after the first season. Even when she loses, Yumiko is really happy and nice towards everyone, and wants to be friends with the people around her, except for Midori. This is a pretty good game to start out with, but unfortunately, this is the best game of the season, and I really wish I were joking here. The Bommies know how infamous Yumiko is within the school, so early on, a lot of them think that if they don't take Yumiko out early, they're all screwed. So Yumiko gets invited to play with Miri and Mio. This girl just looks like a lolly version of Chun-Li. Chun-La-Li. Chun-La-Li, fabulous shit! The game they play is an original game made up for Kakegurui called Nim Zero. It's based on the game of Nim, but with its own unique set of rules. Players are dealt cards that range from 0 to 3, and each player takes turns playing a card and adding its value to the pot, and the player who ends up pushing the value over 9 loses. Fairly simple game with easy to understand rules and a bit of a twist to make it interesting for the story, kinda like the rock paper scissors game in the first season. It's a good premise, but they decide to make it really stupid after the game starts. Because the games at the beginning are forced to be low stakes since nobody really has a lot of vote chips at this point, they have to come up with these weird pseudo vote chips that are for servicing the student council for 24 hours, which 100 votes towards ultimate power versus 3 months of unpaid internship work doesn't seem like a fair trade, but whatever. After one round, Yumiko starts to not really look so good, and she eventually collapses, and the Bommies outright admit that they poisoned Yumiko before the game started.
Hey, yo, what the fuck?
These characters are just outright committing crimes. Nobody goes, hey, if she dies, we have multiple witnesses here that will testify to the fact that you two murdered her? No, we're not gonna gamble with you. We're gonna take Yumiko to the goddamn hospital. What is wrong with you people? Suzui tries to do that, but the Bommies basically go, oh, but you don't know which poison she's suffering from, so I guess you have to gamble with us. And yes, I know Midori tried to make games life or death, but it's made very clear that she gets off on that. These two just decide to attempt murder to force players to gamble. With Yumiko out of the picture, it's Mary to the rescue to fill in her spot at the table. And when the game continues, the Bommies cop out of betting their chips in favor of betting antidote for the poison. Yet remember in the first season when they had to put a price on each person's life, what it was worth and how big of a deal it was? They questioned how it could even be possible, let alone moral. But here they just start coming up with random values for what each thing is worth. oh, this antidote I just happen to have a lunchbox full of syringes of is worth this many votes because I say so. And the characters just go along with it, and they just keep bringing out more of them over time, so even after the players agree to the value changes by putting more of them in play. Oh, and they also decide to go full Jigsaw and force the loser of each round to poison themselves, so the antidotes have even more weight. Wait a second. The first season had the shit room, and the second season has a game where people have to get antidote to a poison.
You know there ain't no antidote for this shit.
I swear at this point, season 3 is gonna have characters playing poker to save someone else from freezing to death inside a meat locker. I can cut this game a little bit of slack for shaking up the formula a bit by having Mary be the Gigabrain in the situation, and also the fact that the Bommies aren't technically cheating, they're just playing at a higher level than the other players at the table. But then that slack gets taken away when the reveal is that the Arbiter is rigging the game with a special shuffling technique that means the cards are a lot less random than they initially appeared. Why? And I didn't even mention the fact that these two basically have a secret language between each other so they can communicate without even moving their mouths like it's a goddamn codec call.
How about switching to nanocommunications first?
Nanocommunications?
Right, silence beats talk when it comes to safety.
Eventually, Mary outsmarts the Bommies, and they're not only forced to completely drop out of the election, but also have run out of antidotes to save Chun-La Li after she poisons herself. And I wanted to make a joke about how she's dead, but she comes back at the end of the season and is perfectly fine. This game won't even let me make fun of it. Okay, it's time for another game to keep the audience engaged. Who are we bringing back from the first season this time? Oh god. So Yumemite hasn't really changed her goal from the first season of wanting to win an Oscar, but now she believes that being in a political position will somehow help her with that goal, and is putting a lot of work into winning this tournament when she comes face to face with her rival this season, Natari, an Oscar-winning Hollywood actress that is also part of the Bommie clan and... Okay, look, you cannot tell me this chick is a high schooler. She looks like she's in her 30s and has won a goddamn Oscar, and yet for some reason drops everything in her life to join this tournament and stick it to someone who genuinely looks up to her. This is like some Captain Quark level shit.
How do you explain your recent success?
Courage, compassion, dashing good looks, iron hard abs!
They decide to battle it out in another idle game that's basically just a retread of the last one, but with a character whose goal makes very little sense, a character we just met and has had very little build-up outside of little nods to her as throwaway lines in Season 1, and Yumiko. I don't really understand why Yumiko even has to be here for this game. She has no real need to be, as the games are clearly pitting Yumemite and Natari against each other. The game does legitimately help humanize Yumemite, which is definitely welcome. I'm not going to turn my nose up at making characters deeper, and when Yumiko and when Yumiko and Yumemite win, Yumemite starts to reevaluate what she really wants out of life and figures out she already kind of has the life she wants. And that's kind of a nice way to cap off her story after viewing her entire career as nothing more than a stepping stone. But it doesn't make up for the fact that this game is really dumb. I don't know what this game is actually called, but I'm calling it the Magic Money Machine. The game they're playing is based on a thought experiment about having to choose between a large amount of group wealth or a comparatively smaller amount of individual gain. And the writers turn this into gambling by adding a buy-in and a lose condition. How does this game work? Well, everyone has their vote chips, and they can choose to either keep those chips or put them into a group pot, which will be multiplied and evenly distributed back to the players. So you can choose to keep your chips, but the number won't change, or you can give them up to help the entire group out with compound interest. But if they don't make enough compound interest to reach a certain point, nobody gets anything and the house keeps it all. And they can also choose to vote out a player they think is hoarding all their chips and not helping the group. Okay, so how long did that take me to explain? Like 15 seconds-ish? Cool. Why does it take this show several minutes to try to explain the same thing and still not explain how it works? And while this is definitely not the show's fault, this game was really hard for me to get invested in because I've already seen real people play this game in Tom Scott's series Money. And believe me when I say it's way more interesting to watch real people play it.
Please open your boxes.
Right. Are you joking me?
This is another game where I wish they pulled away from Yumiko. When I was writing initial notes, I flat out forgot that Yumiko was even here for this game. She just hangs around in the background while we follow Sumeragi and Manyuta dealing with their relationship troubles after their bet resulted in... They try to add drama to this game by turning it into a whodunit mystery on who's not helping out the group to make it to the threshold, and the answer is really convoluted. Sumeragi is giving up her chips to another player to get the group to turn on her, so they vote her out of the competition, but despite Sumeragi giving up her chips, she still comes out on top in first place. I don't understand how that's possible, but I really don't feel like doing the math to figure it out. It was fun to see Manyuda wake up after everything that happened between him and Sumeragi. She actually is still in charge of his life plan after he literally bet his life in the choice poker game, but with how much losing broke him, Sumeragi has to basically tell him to get his shit together. It's made pretty clear that Sumeragi doesn't exactly want to have this new depressed Manyuda hanging off her for the rest of her life, so it is satisfying to see Manyuda come back to life over the course of the game.
骨神ミラスラーバ並びにスメラギー付きお前だ
Okay, this is the big one. I have a lot to say about the tower, and unfortunately, almost nothing about it is positive. I genuinely don't even know where to begin with the tower. It's just an awful idea from the concept stage. They built an entire multi-story tower for a single game that makes no sense whatsoever. The point of the tower is to solve puzzles and be able to make it to the bottom floor and back up to the top before your opponent. First off, how is this even gambling at this point? This is just an elaborate competitive escape room, and that would be an amazing idea if it weren't sold to me as a gambling tower. It kind of has elements of taking risks and picking a better route than your opponent, but it's honestly less about taking risks and more about solving the mystery of the Danganronpa 2 Funhouse.
If I recall, an octagon is a shape with 8 sides, right?
The rules here are just way too complicated and detached from reality that they have to spend the entire time they're in here explaining how it works. And if you as an audience member figure it out before the characters do, which I did, you just have to sit there and wait through a mountain of exposition before anything important happens in the story. And about that story, the reason the characters are even here has nothing to do with the overall plot of the arc. It's a filler episode that focuses on the president's secretary, Sayaka. Sayaka and the president have a bit of a weird bond where neither one of them fully understands the other, and it draws them together. And that's kinda cute, I guess, but this bond causes Sayaka to get extremely nervous as the president puts her roll up for grabs through a gambling tournament, and she gets extremely jealous over how much time the president is focusing on Yumiko. So in a jealous rage, she challenges Yumiko to a gambling match. If Yumiko loses, she drops out of the school. If Sayaka loses, the president and Sayaka must become estranged from one another.
負ければ私は路傍の石になってしまう。ただ遠くから会長を思い続ける石に。
Now, Sayaka is not of a gambling mindset. She's a far more analytical mind that tries to see growth without taking major risks. And I really like her as a character in the first season when she acts primarily as a complete hard-ass rule enforcer watching the chaos unfold and making sure everything is properly regulated, but falls apart when having to make big decisions on her own because every big decision requires a high level of risk. Turning her from that into an overly attached ball of jealousy just isn't as interesting to me. The president adds an extra bet to this game to make things interesting. The one who loses must also jump from the top of the tower, and both parties agree to this. Why? Yumiko doesn't like death games. Granted, this isn't like Midori's death games where Midori hogged all the risk. At least here, the risk is distributed amongst both participants, but come on, they're pulling a death game out of nowhere, and neither character should be insane enough to accept it. The stakes are already high enough for both players that this is a completely unnecessary addition. It's so hard to care about the story here because they're playing a game that directly goes against any of Sayaka's strengths. Then they try to make Sayaka the protagonist of this story and keep Yumiko as an antagonist here, but we've had next to no time to connect with Sayaka as a character since she's been in the background of the show up until this point. She was the one who called the bet, so she doesn't exactly work as an underdog in this scenario, and the game itself is infuriating to watch. Obviously, Yumiko wins, and because of the secondary bet made at the start of the game, Sayaka is then forced to jump from the top of the tower, but just so happens to have picked the correct door to jump from because there's a crash pad at the bottom allowing for a safe fall. Even though that's not at all how a crash pad works, but whatever. Oh, and after winning, Yumiko decides to just let Sayaka and the president not have to fulfill their obligations despite losing, which takes away the entire point of making the gamble in the first place. In Season 1, Mr. Tokyo Ghoul puts his entire life on the line and gets completely screwed over. His life is legitimately ruined, and Sayaka just gets let off the hook. I haven't looked too deep into the hardcore fanbase for this series, but despite that, I already know I'm in the minority with my thoughts on the tower. People talk about this like it's the absolute highlight of XX, and I just can't. I was bored, annoyed, and absolutely baffled by this entire side plot that hijacked the main story. This game was painful to sit through. I haven't talked about him until now because he hasn't exactly been relevant, but in between the games, the show keeps cutting back to this dude named Rei Batsubami.
きつい言葉は可愛らしい唇を。
あんた何やって
歪めてしまう。
I love him. He isn't part of the academy, but despite this, he feels a connection to the house pets because the rest of the Bami clan treats him like absolute trash. So he's been able to connect with the outcast students in the background and somehow amass a huge amount of chips, and decides to hold an auction for them. You say how many votes you want to offer up in exchange for a box of 100 votes, and the highest bidder wins. But if you make the bid, you're on the hook to pay, even if someone else bids against you. Okay, so first off, the premise doesn't even make sense because they made it clear the chips were only transferable through gambling. You're not allowed to hand over your chips to someone else, but they circumvent that by having all of the random students who haven't participated in the games all bet on if Rei would win the whole election. But the election isn't over, so he shouldn't have the chips because there's no way that bet could have ever been decided on yet. And on top of that, how many students are in this school? Rei just has a near infinite pool of chips until the plot demands that Rei runs out. There are some fun moments early on with the characters constantly outbidding each other and getting into screaming matches, while not realizing that the members of the Bami clan are also bidding from a separate room and able to screw over the group in front of the stage. But once that's revealed, it stops being fun and just starts getting really annoying. Yumiko decides to do something that I cannot understand, even from her weird as hell logic of putting everything on the line. The suitcases are filled with the money that Yumiko won against Manyuda in the first season. 3 billion yen.
Billions. With a B.
Which she uses to just buy one set of votes off of Rei. It's true that Yumiko sees the votes as worthless and wants to do a real gamble with real money. Wow, Yumiko realized the biggest problem with the plot and called it out. Wish the writers realized that. But the problem is that she's buying votes with the money. The thing she sees is useless. Hell, maybe there's some nuance that I'm missing here, but I don't get this at all. It's then revealed that Rei is a girl? Wow. This would be a big revelation if it had any significance to the plot at all. Seriously, what was this meant to achieve other than having a twist for the sake of having a twist? We get a lot of backstory to Rei about how the Bami clan saw her as nothing more than a slave, and it does kind of feel bad that the one time Rei took a risk to hopefully get out of her terrible situation, it didn't exactly pay off. The auction continues, and after screaming at each other to not bet against one another, none of the characters follow through with that and continue to keep raising the bets higher and higher until Yumiko gets an idea.
Are you ready?
Obviously, nobody bets against this, and Yumiko keeps putting more 101 bets out until suddenly switching to betting a single chip. This somehow wakes up everyone else to the obvious answer of stop going against each other if you have the opportunity to beat the house, you absolute lemons! There's this montage of characters winning a lot of votes, so I can't even keep up with who has a lot of votes now, and even if I could, I honestly don't care at this point. Yumiko gives a pep talk to Rei, and after realizing that they're potentially closer in relation than they originally thought, they decide to do one final bet together. Rei wagers the 3 billion yen Yumiko just gave her, and Yumiko wagers her family name, which probably means a lot more in Japan, but it still feels like a stupid wager. And I want to make it very clear that I did not edit this next clip. This is actually how the show comes together.
彼女に自分を重ねたってわけ?
The show then wraps up by basically going, oh, Ray's doing all right now despite losing that bet. See you all next time, and then the show ends. What the hell? You have this climactic moment, end it in the middle of the climax, and then wrap the season up in 30 seconds of saying, hey, it all worked out.
Well, that was anticlimactic.
Overall, Season 2 was a major letdown. I know part of my problem was that it left off in the middle of an arc, and the manga does continue on from this point, but let me be perfectly clear here, I don't care. I said in the beginning that the manga didn't matter to me because an adaptation has to stand on its own. But truthfully, the reason it doesn't matter to me is because I don't care how this story continues because it already had a perfect endpoint, and it continued on with something of much lesser quality. XX is built on a shaky premise that removes too much of what made the first season so great. If it had intrigued me enough, I actually would go out and see what happens next with the manga, but at this point, I'm burned out. The series has lost my interest entirely to the point that I haven't even watched Kakegurui Twin yet, a series starring my favorite character in the show. And I didn't even mention the ongoing side plots in Season 2 regarding the president's twin sister or this girl in a wheelchair because they go nowhere either. While the gambling was the initial draw of the show, it's the over-the-top characters that kept things going because they were just so fun to be around. I remembered all of the major characters from Season 1 and actually remembered their names because they were fun and interesting, while Season 2, outside of redheaded Celestia Ludenberg and Ray, all of them are just forgettable and leave no impact. Kakegurui is a show all about risk, and that's why it's a major disappointment to see Season 2 do nothing but play everything safe.